friends, my name is Mackesy, and today I'll be talking about the 8 books that I read last month. First up though, this video has been graciously sponsored by Book of the Month. Anyone who knows my channel knows that I love Book of the Month. In fact, this month marks 5 years that I've been with the service, so I was super excited when they reached out to me about this opportunity. For those of you who maybe don't know, Book of the Month is a subscription service, and their mission is to promote new and emerging authors and to help people find books that they love. Every month, the Book of the Month team curates a selection of new or early release books, and it is a risk-free service, so you can always skip a month without any cost or penalty. I get so excited at the beginning of every month to pick my book. I am primarily a library reader, and so I try not to buy books that I have not read, but my one big exception is Book of the Month. And as you can tell with how long I've been with their service, I just genuinely enjoy their selection and I trust their selection. I've got the July picks with me, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. The People We Keep by Allison Larkin. This is an adult fiction story about a girl named April who leaves the confines of her hometown of Little Rivers and ends up in Ithaca and finds that it feels like home for her. She really starts connecting with the people at the local coffee shop, and she begins to question the sense of belonging and if these new friends are too good to be true, and she captures all of that experience in the music and lyrics that she's writing. This probably would have been my pick for this month, particularly because I'm such a sucker for books that feature lyrics or music or musicians, and that would have been the selling point for me. Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. This is a mystery about 2 fathers who have very little in common except for their criminal past, and now that their sons have been murdered. Their sons were married to each other, they were found murdered, and so these 2 dads come together, and the book is described as being about bloody retribution and redemption. So that's a heck of a combo. Sisters in Arms by Kaya Alderson is a historical fiction based on the true story of the 6888, the first and only all-black battalion of the Women's Army Corps. This story follows 2 women who come from very different backgrounds, but who are both determined to do all they can to make sure that their mission succeeds, even though there are a lot of obstacles and it seems like everyone around them wants them to fail. We Are the Brennans by Tracy Lang is about a woman who wakes up in LA in a hospital after a drunk driving accident and decides to return home to her family on the East Coast, even though she ran away from them, essentially from her family, from her boyfriend 5 years earlier with very little explanation. So as she comes home, she's having to navigate all of those relationships, but also a lot of the family secrets, especially as somebody is targeting the family business and it is threatening them with financial ruin. And finally, 56 Days by Catherine Ryan Howard, and this is about 2 people who start dating like the week that COVID gets to Ireland. So they decide to lock down together and see how the relationship goes, and it ends with there being a dead body in the apartment that they share, and so this is the mystery of what exactly happened over the 56 days that these 2 people were quarantined together. I probably would have put this one as an add-on. I don't know if I could have decided between this one and The People We Keep, so maybe I would have gotten them both. If you are interested in Book of the Month or any of the books that I mentioned, I will have a link to their website down below, and you can buy your first box for $9.99 with the code SUNNY5, so I will have all of that information in the description. Thanks again to Book of the Month for sending me these, and thanks to you guys for your support and your attention. And now into what I read last month. First up, in nonfiction, I read White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad. In this, Hamad takes a comprehensive look from the slave era where white women would fight in court for their slaves, throughout colonialism to the modern workplace, and even things like modern pop culture and what politicians of color face presently. And she basically looks at white women's active participation in oppression. I picked this up actually because of TikTok. So on TikTok, there was a trend going around where people would like fake cry, and then the sound would say turn it off, and then they would switch and like quickly go from crying to not crying. So there was a lot of discourse about how it was an uncomfortable trend to watch as white women did this fake crying thing, especially for people of color, because white tears have often been weaponized against people of color. So in seeing a few of those TikToks about that conversation, in one of the comment sections, somebody said, you guys need to read White Tears, Brown Scars. And I was like, you know, that comment is right. I do need to read this. So I picked this up for that reason, and it was actually amazing context context for that conversation that was happening, but just in general, really wonderful information. Hamad is writing from a very specific lens and perspective. She's Arabic and she's Australian, but she does a wonderful job trying to bring in different perspectives and make this, like I said, very comprehensive. And that is definitely a strength of this, because I think there was that attempt to be very intersectional, but I think in some ways it kind of doubled as a weakness, because there were points where I was wishing it went a little bit deeper, but this seemed to be going more wide than deep. And I don't mean that to be like any sort of like real complaint, because I think that this is such a worthwhile piece. I learned a lot. It also got me thinking in lots of different ways about like the modern weaponization of white tears, particularly as we see things like Barbecue Becky. I was thinking a lot about the workplace and how this fits in. I work in HR, so how this fits in with things that we see as people of color complain about different circumstances, how it gets switched so that often the white counterpart becomes the victim. So I just had so many thoughts. I appreciated the project that this was, and I recommend this to everybody who continues to make it a priority to read about anti-racism. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read On Juneteenth by Annette Gordon-Reed, and this is a collection of essays. I wanted to learn more about Juneteenth, and this did something that I absolutely love in nonfiction, and it is that it gave us historical context about the formation of Texas leading up to Juneteenth, but it tied it to very personal history for Gordon-Reed. She grew up in Texas, so she tells us a lot about her growing up experience, being the first and only Black girl in her school that she was attending at that time, and just pulling in a lot of that personal context to really ground what she was telling us in sort of like this larger context of US history and Texas history. I will say that once we got to the Juneteenth portion of this, it did peter out a little bit. I felt like that the ending just kind of like faded out in a way. I don't know what else I was expecting this to say about Juneteenth. It really did give a lot of that context on the front end, but overall I just really enjoyed it, and now I am determined to read Gordon Reed's works about Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson. That is now on my radar as well, and I gave this one also 4.5 out of 5 stars. And then I read Uncomfortable Conversations with a Black Man by Emmanuel Acho. This is modeled after a series of videos of the same name that Acho does, in which he answers questions that white people submit. I would call this, it is very conversational, which you would expect from the title. It really does have that air of Acho just kind of like chatting with you. And I listened to this on audiobook, and he reads the audiobook, so all of that really gave to the air of this being him like sitting down and answering these things in a really like basic and approachable manner. I'll also say that this is very much a primer. It is a basic introduction to concepts of anti-racism. Like, if you are still asking yourself, why can't I say the N-word, then this is a book for you. But even saying that, I feel like it also gives good sort of talking points and vocabulary for anybody interested in talking to their family members or loved ones or at work about anti-racism concept. This breaks it down in a way that you can also use this language in your day-to-day life and conversations. Acho approaches each of the questions that he includes in the essays from this perspective of giving a historical context to why this is a thing, then kind of seating it in the present and understanding why it is still a thing. And then he also gives additional resources and things to like watch or read or look into if you want to learn more about the topic. I had an interesting reading experience because I can sit back and see how well it was constructed and how useful it will be to people, but I also was just like so frustrated, like thinking about, and this is no fault of Acho's, but like just thinking about the fact that we still have to have conversations about why you can't say the N-word or no, you can't touch my hair. Like I can see that being frustrating for other BIPOC readers. So just know that this is a conversational primer that does what it sets out to do very well. I'd give this 3.5, 4 out of 5 stars. I read one thriller, and that was Every Last Fear by Alex Finlay. And in the story, an NYU student gets back to his dorm after a night of partying to the news that his entire family has been killed during a vacation to Mexico. So this makes the news, particularly because this isn't the first time his family has been involved, sort of with national coverage. His older brother is currently serving a life sentence for killing his girlfriend, happened, and it was a subject of like a documentary or whatnot, whether or not his older brother was guilty, specifically because his confession was coerced. I was highly engaged in the story while I was reading it. Like, I was gripped by the entire thing. Every new piece was interesting to me. I was reading this on vacation, so this was like a poolside read for me. I love reading like thrillers and darker stuff by the pool. I'm not like a beach read sort of person. Like, give me your dark stuff while I'm in the sun. Like, that is my magic combination. So I had a blast reading this. And then after I closed it and I finished it and I started to reflect, there were a couple of things that were not the best that I can look back on. And one is that I felt like the ending, like, bad guy, both the murderer and sort of like who he was connected to, it felt a little bit telegraphed to me. I wasn't like actively guessing while I was reading, but when I got to the revelation, it was a very like, oh, sort of thing, because like yeah, duh, that was the bad guy. So that made it like a little bit step down, even though I had a wonderful reading experience. This isn't like the best crafted thing for me personally, because I like my endings to be satisfying, that I can look back and put the pieces together, but not obvious where I go, oh, duh. Also, there was a portion of this, so the family goes to Mexico on vacation, and that's where they're killed. And I just, in reflecting and looking back on it, like, I'm not entirely sure why it had to be Mexico, particularly because there are very few Mexican characters in this, and the ones that are portrayed really flatly and in a stereotypical manner. And the whole thing with like the Mexican police and everything, it was just like exactly what you would expect of the stereotype and nothing more. It wasn't the best thing. It gave me the vibes, as soon as we like went to Mexico, it gave me the vibes of like the thing in film, the yellow filter. Whenever you're in a third world country in a film, like they put that yellow filter in it to make it look like dirtier, so you know you're not in the US anymore. It gave me those vibes, but in a written format. On reflection, I was uncomfortable with that. So incredibly readable, very gripping, and it hit all of the notes that I wanted from a thriller. On retrospect, the revelation and the setting could have used some work, so overall I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, I read We Run the Tides by Vendela Vida, and this is a YA coming of age story in which a teenage girl named Eulaby, it has this like group of friends. They kind of run their little city, at least in their own minds, right? And she has a falling out with them after the like main girl, the it girl, lies and says that she saw somebody like parked near the school and he was like doing some indecent exposure. But when the police question Eulaby, she says that that's not at all what she saw happen. So her group of friends like ostracize her, and that's the inciting incident. But this is very much a snapshot story. It isn't very plot driven or character driven. We're just kind of looking at this teenage period in Eulaby's life, particularly following this incident, and as that main it girl continues to kind of fabricate things about her life and her experience and does it for attention. So this was a really, really weird story. I really enjoyed it. It is well written, and I am a sucker for coming of age stories, even though this one was a little bit darker than what I usually read. Like, coming of age stories typically have themes that are a little bit about like hope and love and things like that, identity, coming into one's own. And this was a little bit darker in what it was saying about like the teenage years, and especially like the meanness of teen girls. And there were things that happened to Eulaby that in her point of view weren't necessarily like big deals to her, but to us as the reader, as adults reading this, like content warnings for sure. So the entire thing was just a really strange reading experience, but it was very well written and it was gripping. Like, it kind of felt like a train wreck, like I couldn't look away. So my like big thing with this, however, is that after reading like the whole thing and being like, this is strange and great, is that something happens at the end that like happened really abruptly and came a little bit out of left field for me. And not only did it come out of left field, like it happens and we just kind of move away from it very quickly, and it's somebody's death. So it felt a little like, I don't know, undone, a little bit cheap the way that it was handled. It was just like, this thing that you thought was happening didn't happen. Look over here, somebody died. And that was the end. And I was kind of like, it added to the like off balance feeling that it had throughout the book, but also it wasn't incredibly satisfying. And then at the very end, we do jump ahead in time and catch up with some of these characters in a way that felt a little convenient. Like, I appreciated that look at them and kind of understanding what the story was saying overall, but the way that it happened was a little convenient. And also there were some additional like things that the author was saying. They grew up in this like neighborhood near San Francisco, and it was like upper middle class, the neighborhood. And so we were looking a little bit about how some of the families there kind of lucked into getting into that area. And so the character Eulaby is reflecting on how now her family can't even afford to be in that area, which, you know, I get it. Like, that is not probably untrue, but also in the context of like this white upper middle class area, like being priced out of white upper middle class, like I was kind of like, okay. So those are my quibbles with this overall, but like I said, really well written, really interesting, put me off balance, and I couldn't look away, so I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Next, we have the only one of these books that I actually read in physical copy, and it's The Boy, the Mole, the Fox, and the Horse by Charlie Mackesy. And this is just like a little picture book, basically, and I had heard really wonderful things about this, so I went in, I think, with high expectations. And so when I first started reading it, I was a little bit underwhelmed, both by kind of the story and the art, which just has this like sketchy, undone sort of look to it. But then as I adjusted my expectations and just kind of let myself sink into the story, I thought it was really pleasant. It's very cozy and warm. It is nothing that is like incredibly deep, but there are little like bits of like affirmations and things about being kind to one another and asking for help when you need it, and friendship and things like that just served like as the pick-me-up that it was meant to be. And I even really started to appreciate the art style of it. My one complaint was that sometimes this like handwritten font was a little tough to read. Like, I had to go back over a couple of lines just to make sure that I was reading them correctly. But overall, I can see myself revisiting this for when I need that pick-me-up. And also, I had the strongest urge to like journal in this, or to add, I don't know, I'm not a I don't journal, but while I was reading this, I couldn't help but thinking about how wonderful it would be to just like add your own annotations and observations in this. And even if, you know, if somebody drew, I don't draw, to like continue to add to the artwork, I think it would just be a wonderful way to experience this, to revisit it over the years. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. And then finally, I read 2 romances. One was One Last Stop by Casey McQuiston. So in this story, we have a woman who has recently moved to New York City. She's getting to know her quirky like roommates and find a place for herself, and she meets a woman on the subway that she immediately feels attracted to. And it turns out that this woman on the subway is actually stuck on the subway, like she can never leave. So the main character starts like investigating and looking into like what exactly is going on here. So there is that like speculative aspect to this otherwise contemporary romance feeling book. I had not read Red, White, and Royal Blue by McQuiston. Sam from Thoughts on Tomes had described that book as sort of like romanticizing politics in a way that didn't feel great. I think she read it last year in 2020, but also like it's 2021 and I still don't want to read about like romanticized politics or politicians. So that has always kind of been in my head, blocking that experience. But McQuiston came out with this new one and I wanted to read this one because I know people really enjoyed Red, White, and Royal Blue. And unfortunately, this one really didn't land for me. And it's difficult to explain exactly why, because it felt like there were a number of elements that were just slightly off. And like the cumulative experience was one where I was like, I don't know, it wasn't an enjoyable reading experience. So I'm going to try and break it down, but I realize that each of the elements I'm going to talk about is just slightly off. They're not big complaints, but again, it is like all of that together that kind of put me off of this. So first, the pacing I think was a little unbalanced. The first half of this book was really slow and it felt like nothing was happening. And then in the second half of the book, you really start to get the pieces put together. So like the unbalanced portion of this made it tough for me to get into it and stick with it, though I did appreciate when the pace picked up in the second half. Secondly, the romance was difficult to enjoy because Jane, the character on the subway, is so passive. She really is like stuck, and so it feels like everything that is happening is being acted upon her by the story, and so it gave icky vibes to the romance overall, especially because Jane is a woman of color and August is white. And there was an additional line where Jane is talking about some of the racism that she felt like in the past, and August says something along the lines of well, people aren't like that anymore. And I was like, they aren't. That's news to me. So it kept having these little moments that made me feel like McQuiston didn't entirely understand or acknowledge the dynamics between her two main characters, and in general it made the romance kind of not my thing. I will also add that because Jane is stuck on the subway, everything that happens in this relationship, including all of these sexual things, happen on the subway, and some people are going to be fine with that. I was a little squicked out. I don't know that I would have thought to be squicked out for this had it not been for McQuiston constantly describing the subway as dirty and smelly and rats everywhere, and then it was grope and I was like, whoa, what are we doing here? And you just told me it was dirty and smelly and rats are everywhere. So I was uncomfortable with that as well. The supporting characters, her roommates, I really enjoyed them at the beginning. I was enjoying their vibes and their quirkiness, but it kind of got where they were a little too quirky and the humor started to wear on me. At first it was and then I didn't find it so funny as I kept reading, and then the characters themselves never really felt like they were fully developed or differentiated. In my head, they're just lumped in as the roommates because they were so kind of flatly portrayed, or they had one defining characteristic. There was one who was a psychic, and so he always just appeared to say something psychic-y, and so there was nothing else to that character. And because a lot of these supporting characters were also people of color, the way that they slotted into August's story, just there to help her and disappear, also felt a little bit off to me. And then there's a whole portion of the story where August has learned to sort of investigate and look into things because of her mother. Her mother's brother disappeared when she was young, so she's dedicated her whole life to trying to figure out what happened to her brother. And when she had August, very much pulled her into this as well. And so August is partially in New York to sort of escape that, and then she gets involved with this new mystery portion of it and has to come to terms with her relationship with her mother. So there were some things about her life and Jane that connected in really convenient ways, in ways that I was just I don't know, I'm suspending disbelief here about the speculative aspect, and I am totally fine with that. It was the connections things, the more rooted in real life things that I had a difficult time with. I didn't feel like they were introduced naturally to the story. I didn't feel like they were necessary also to the story. I don't know why we needed those things. So yeah, it was just a pile-on of things that weren't quite right, and overall I gave this 2.5 out of 5 stars. And finally, I read Rafe, A Buff Male Nanny by Rebekah Weatherspoon. This is a relatively short contemporary romance about a man, a buff male nanny, who gets a new job with a family and just sort of immediately knows that he's attracted to the mom and tells her as much. And so they are trying to figure out their relationship, but also dealing with the mom's ex-husband, who is a bad dude. That was you know, all my summaries can't be winners. Anyways, this was just, I loved that this got immediately to the point. This man meets the mom and is like, oh my gosh, I'm attracted to her. And then immediately tells her look, I'll take this job, but I'm attracted to you. And I just loved that. I loved that it got to the point. I loved that this relationship, all of the strife and problems were mostly external. They liked each other and they kept communicating about it, but there were all of these additional elements that they had to deal deal with, and sometimes I'm just in the mood for that kind of romance where it isn't very angsty, it's just sort of external circumstances that they have to deal with, and this like gave what it was supposed to give. Honestly, I think after One Last Stop I just wanted like a romance to sort of reset me, and this did the trick. I gave this 3.5, 4 out of 5 stars. And that's it. That's everything that I read last month. It was a really weird and hectic month. I feel like I say that all the time, but listen, I work in education. I support 7 schools in the state of Florida, and it was the end of the school year. So that was going on in the beginning of June. And then I took a vacation, which was wonderful. But as soon as we got back, we heard that my uncle had passed away. He was diagnosed with cancer, so we knew that he was kind of battling against this, but unfortunately he passed away. So we immediately got here, hopped on another plane, and went to New Jersey to be with my aunt and to attend the funeral. So that took up a chunk of my time. And then when I got back, I was so behind because I hadn't been at work for so long. I was trying to catch up with work, and then we heard that some of the unvaccinated members of my family who attended the funeral had caught COVID, and so that included some of my immediate family. And so I was watching some of my nieces and nephews while people were quarantined and trying to make sure everybody stayed as healthy as possible. So it was a lot, but I made it. And I also hit 10K on TikTok, which is wild to me because it took me years to get 10K on YouTube. But, I don't mean to only be on TikTok. Like, I'm not abandoning this channel. It's just so much easier, or it was last month, to squeeze in content in between things over on TikTok, which is like a minute versus like sitting down and doing this whole thing. So I'm hoping July is a little less hectic than June, but that is my hope all of the time. We shall see. I appreciate you guys so much for sticking with me, for your continued support, and I'd love to talk to you about all of these books or any of the ones that you have read or would like to read down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. Next I read We Run the Tides by Vendela, Vida. I gotta do this again. Next I read We Run the Tides by Vendela, Vida.